Darius Jackson stood at Gate C-19 in Dallas-Fort Worth, Navy suit crisp, helping tiny Rosa Morales with her bags. Suddenly, Karen Voss, a blonde flight attendant, charged in, shoving him back, barking, "You don't belong here," as passengers gasped. Darius smirked, walked off, but his briefcase gleamed with SkyWest Airlines CEO in gold. Rosa whispered, "They'll regret this," her voice trembling with prophecy. What revenge brews when power hides in plain sight? Before we dive in, where are you watching from? If you stand for justice, hit like, subscribe, and join us for more epic showdowns. Darius Jackson kept his cool as he guided Rosa Morales through the bustling chaos of Gate C-19 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, her frail fingers digging into his arm like she was anchoring herself to a lifeline, her worn canvas bag slung over his shoulder while the crowd shuffled around them, some tossing curious glances, others too buried in their phones to notice an elderly Latina woman leaning on a tall black man in a navy suit that fit just sharp enough to turn heads but not scream for attention, and he liked it that way, preferring to move through the world without fanfare, especially on a muggy Texas morning where the air clung to your skin like damp cotton, the kind of day where folks were already on edge waiting for their flights to anywhere but here. And Rosa, with her gray-streaked hair pulled tight under a faded yellow scarf, kept muttering thanks under her breath, her voice soft but steady, telling him about her daughter waiting in Phoenix, how she hadn't seen her in 2 years since the last family reunion got canceled over some flu scare. And Darius nodded along, his deep brown eyes scanning the gate ahead, catching the flicker of impatience in the staff behind the counter. But he didn't flinch, didn't rush her, just kept that slow, deliberate pace like he was escorting a queen through a palace instead of a budget airline terminal with scuffed linoleum floors and flickering fluorescent lights. And Rosa clutched her purse tighter, her arthritis-swollen knuckles whitening as they neared the jetway, where Karen Voss stood waiting, her blonde ponytail pulled so tight it looked like it was yanking her face into a permanent scowl, her pale, blue eyes narrowing as they locked onto Darius, and he could feel the shift before she even opened her mouth. The way her posture stiffened, clipboard gripped like a shield, her heels clicking sharp against the floor as she stormed over, cutting through the line of passengers with the kind of authority that screamed she owned this patch of airport real estate. And without a word of greeting, she planted herself in front of them, voice slicing through the hum of the crowd. "Sir, you can't be here." Her tone dripping with accusation, eyes darting between him and Rosa like they were plotting a heist instead of boarding a plane, and Darius tilted his head, keeping his voice low. "I'm assisting her, she's struggling to walk," but Karen didn't blink, didn't soften, just snapped back. "We have staff for that. You're disrupting protocol," her words clipped and final, like she'd already decided he was a problem before he even stepped into her line of sight, and Rosa tightened her grip on his arm, her breath hitching. As she tried to speak, "He's helping me, por favor." But Karen ignored her, her glare fixed on Darius. "Step away from the gate now." And he felt that familiar heat creeping up his neck, the kind that came from years of being sized up and dismissed, but he swallowed it down, kept his face smooth. "Ma'am, I'm just making sure she gets on," he said, steady as stone. And that's when Karen's patience snapped, her voice rising. "I said back away." Loud enough that heads turned, phones slipped out of pockets, and the air thickened with that electric buzz of people sensing a scene about to unfold. And before Darius could respond, she spun around, slamming, her finger onto the wall intercom, the red light flashing like a warning beacon, her voice barking into it. "Security to C-19 now," and Rosa gasped, her eyes wide with panic. No, he's good," she pleaded, but Karen cut her off, turning to her with a syrupy fake smile. "Ma'am, we'll handle it. He's interfering." And Darius caught the shift in her tone, the way she flipped from venom to velvet depending on who she was facing, and it hit him square in the chest. This wasn't about rules, it was about him, about the color of his skin standing out too bold against the pale backdrop of her expectations. And within seconds, 2 security guards lumbered into view. Big guys with buzz cuts and stiff gray uniforms, their boots thudding. Heavy on the floor, one cracking his knuckles like he was itching for a fight, the other with a hand hovering near his radio. And they zeroed in on Darius, cutting through the crowd like sharks through water. "Sir, you need to come with us," the first one grunted, his voice flat and mechanical. And Darius looked down at Rosa, her face crumpled with fear, then back at Karen, who stood there smirking. Arms crossed like she'd just won a prize, and he could have argued, could have raised his voice. But he saw the tremble in Rosa's hands and knew she didn't need that kind of chaos. So he held up a hand. "Fine. I'm going." His tone, even. But then he leaned in close to Karen, close enough she could feel the weight of his words. "You'll see me again," he said, low and deliberate, a promise wrapped in velvet. And her smirk faltered for half a heartbeat before she waved the guards on. "Get him out." And they grabbed him, one on each arm, their grips tight enough to bruise, dragging him back through the terminal as passengers gawked, some whispering, others filming, the whole scene playing out like a bad movie. He couldn't pause, and Rosa called after him. "Thank you, hijo," her voice cracking. But the guards didn't slow, hauling him past the coffee stands and overpriced gift shops, their radios crackling, with static, one muttering into it. Subject removed, like he was some kind of threat instead of a guy helping an old woman board a plane. And when they finally hit the sliding glass doors at the terminal's edge, they shoved him out into the sticky Texas heat, the taller one sneering, "Nice suit doesn't mean you run the place." And the other laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed as they turned back inside, leaving Darius standing there alone on the curb, the sun beating down on his shoulders, his jaw tight, his bag still clutched in one hand, and he adjusted his tie, smoothing the fabric with a slow, deliberate motion, because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the airport hummed behind him, oblivious to the storm he was about to unleash, he pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with a single notification, a text from his assistant, "Board meeting in 2 hours," and he exhaled, sharp and focused, because Karen and her goons had no idea who they'd just crossed. No clue that the man they'd tossed out like trash was the one signing their paychecks. And as he slid into the back seat of a waiting car, the leather cool against his back, he muttered to himself, "Let's see how they like the view from the bottom." His mind already racing ahead to the reckoning he'd bring crashing down on them all, because this wasn't just about one gate, one moment. It was about every time he'd been told he didn't belong. And now, with the power he'd kept quiet for so long, he was ready to make them feel every ounce of that weight, step by calculated step until the whole damn system shook. Darius Jackson didn't waste a second after the guards dumped him outside Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the sticky heat pressing against his navy suit as he stood on the curb, the sting of Karen Voss's smug dismissal still burning in his chest. And he yanked his phone from his pocket, the sleek black case glinting under the Texas sun, his fingers flying across the screen as he pulled up the passenger footage he'd snagged from a shaky-handed kid in a Cowboys jersey who'd filmed the whole Gate C-19 fiasco. The video crystal clear despite the chaos, showing him steadying Rosa Morales, her frail frame leaning hard into his arm, her voice pleading as Karen barked orders and security swooped in like vultures on roadkill, and he smirked, dark and quiet. Because this wasn't just evidence, it was ammunition. So he fired it off in an email to Tanya Brooks, his COO at SkyWest Airlines. The subject line simple: "Gate incident, handle it." Attaching the clip with no fluff, no begging, just the raw truth of a black man dragged out for daring to help an old woman board a plane. And he slid into his car, the engine purring as he peeled away from the terminal, the city sprawling out in front of him like a chessboard he was about to flip. Because what kind of world lets a good deed turn into a public shaming just because of the skin you're in? And within 20 minutes, his phone buzzed, Tanya's name flashing, her reply short and sharp, "We're on it, boss." And he nodded to himself, leaning back against the leather seat, because Tanya didn't mess around. A woman who'd climbed from gate agent to C-suite with a mind like a steel trap, and he trusted her to move fast. So he checked into a hotel 3 miles down I-35. A sleek tower with glass walls and overpriced coffee in the lobby, dropping his bags in a suite that overlooked the Dallas skyline, the kind of view that reminded him how far he'd come from the cramped apartment in Oak Cliff, where he'd grown up dodging fists and worse. And he flipped on the TV, muting the sound as he waited, knowing the wheels were already turning, because how long could a company ignore a video like that? One that showed their own staff treating a man like a criminal for no damn reason. And sure enough, hours later, the news ticker on Channel 8 lit up. SkyWest Airlines suspends flight attendant. After viral video, the anchor's voice cutting through the silence as he unmuted it, her tone crisp. A disturbing clip from DFW Airport has sparked outrage online, showing a flight attendant, identified as Karen Voss, denying a man assistance to an elderly passenger before calling security. And they played it, the whole ugly scene. Rosa's trembling hands, Karen's pinched face, the guards hauling him off. And Darius leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the world finally see what he'd felt his whole life. That invisible wall slamming down the second you didn't fit their picture of who belonged. And the anchor kept going. SkyWest's statement confirms Voss's suspension pending investigation, citing unprofessional conduct. And he exhaled, slow and heavy, because this felt like a win, didn't it? A crack in the armor of a system that chewed up people like him and spat them out. And his phone rang again, this time Rosa's number, her voice shaky but warm. "Mr. Darius, I made it to Phoenix. My daughter's got me now, thank you." And he smiled, real this time. "You're welcome, Ms. Rosa. Rest easy." Because hearing her safe made the bruises on his arms from those guards' grips sting a little less. And he hung up, flipping channels, catching the tail end of a pundit saying, "This is what accountability looks like." And he thought, yeah, maybe it is. Maybe this time they'd actually learn. So he pulled out his tablet, sketching notes for a company-wide memo, something about dignity, about respect, about tearing down the garbage that let this happen. Because as CEO, he could do that, couldn't he? Rewrite the rules from the top. And he pictured Karen sitting at home, her badge yanked, her smirk wiped clean, and it felt good, felt right, like the scales were tipping his way for once. But what happens when the people who lose don't just slink off quietly, when they've got friends who hate losing even more? And he didn't see it yet. Didn't hear the whispers starting to coil in the shadows of the airline's lower ranks. Because while he sat there, basking in this fragile triumph, Karen was already huddled with Phil Grayson, the gate manager with a buzz cut and a grudge, her voice low and venomous. "He thinks he's won, but we're not done." And Phil nodded, his fingers tapping a burner phone. Because how do you let a guy like Darius walk away with the last word when you've got power of your own to swing? And Darius, oblivious, sipped a glass of water, staring out at the city lights, thinking the storm was over, that justice had landed. But what kind of fool believes a single suspension stops a machine built to grind you down? So hey, if you're raging at how they treated Darius, drop a comment with number 1 below. Because who else thinks a good deed shouldn't end with handcuffs just for being black? And if you're nodding along, smash that like button, hit subscribe, because we're diving deeper into this fight. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. Because tell me this, what do you do when the people who hate you don't just fade away? When they come back swinging with something so twisted it makes a suspension look like a slap on the wrist? And how far does Darius have to push before the whole damn house of cards comes crashing down? Darius Jackson barely had time to savor the taste of triumph. The hotel suite's plush carpet soft under his polished shoes as he scrolled through news alerts on his tablet. The Dallas skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a promise he'd finally claimed, because Karen Voss's suspension still echoed in his ears. The TV replaying that grainy Gate C-19 clip on loop, Rosa Morales' grateful voice lingering from their call, and he'd let himself believe just for a moment that the world might bend toward justice this time, that a viral video and a quick corporate slap could rewrite the rules. But across town, in a dim corner of a chain diner off I-35, Karen sat hunched over a sticky table, her blonde ponytail fraying at the ends, her uniform swapped for a wrinkled hoodie that did nothing to hide the fury carving lines into her face. And beside her, Phil Grayson, the gate manager with a jaw like a brick and eyes that glinted cold under the diner's buzzing lights, cracked his knuckles slow and deliberate, his voice a low growl. "He doesn't get to walk away from this." And Karen nodded, her nails digging into the cheap laminate. "Not after humiliating me, not after taking my job." Because to her that suspension wasn't discipline, it was a personal attack. A black man in a suit daring to step into her domain and come out on top, and she couldn't stomach it, wouldn't let it stand. So Phil leaned in, his breath sour with coffee. "We've got people, we can spin this." And she smirked, sharp and bitter. "Then let's make him the bad guy. Because what better way to claw back power than to flip the script?" And they didn't waste time. Phil pulling strings with a buddy from his old security gig, a guy who knew how to splice video like a pro. And by midnight they had it, a doctored cut of that same gate footage. Only now it showed Darius lunging at Karen, his arm swinging in a blur of edited frames, Rosa's pleas muted out. The whole thing twisted to look like he'd snapped, like he'd been the aggressor all along, and they leaked it fast, uploading it from a burner account with a caption screaming, "The real story. Violent passenger attack staff." Because who checks the fine print when outrage is the fuel? And Darius woke up to his phone buzzing off the nightstand, the screen lighting up with notifications, dozens, then hundreds, emails pouring in from SkyWest employees he'd never met. "You're a disgrace. Resign now. Thought you were better than this." And he blinked, groggy, the clock glowing 3:17, his stomach dropping as he opened X and saw the clip, grainy but damning, trending under Uash Darius. The threat, already at 50,000 views and climbing, passengers from C-19 chiming in. I knew he was trouble, even though half of them hadn't looked up from their screens that day. And he watched it again, frame by frame, his jaw tightening as he spotted the choppy edit. The way his hand never actually moved like that. But who cared about truth when the lie was this loud and his phone rang? Tanya Brooks's voice cutting through the haze. "Darius, this is bad. The board's freaking out." And he sat up, sheets pooling around him. "It's fake, Tanya. You know that." But she sighed, heavy. "Doesn't matter what I know. They're saying you've tanked our image. They want a meeting now?" And he could hear the strain in her words, the unspoken fear that even she might be doubting him. Because how do you fight a ghost story when everyone's already scared? And he threw on a shirt, pacing the room, the carpet, wearing thin under his steps as he pulled up his inbox, hate mail piling up, "Go back where you came from." Typical thug in a tie, each one a knife twist deeper than the last. And he stopped, staring at the screen, because this wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was a machine waking up, a system that didn't like being poked. And Phil, back at the diner, grinned over a cold fry. "Told you they'll eat it up," while Karen scrolled her own phone, liking every nasty comment, her suspension forgotten in the rush of revenge. Because what's a job loss when you can burn a man's life to the ground? And Darius felt the walls closing in, the victory from yesterday dissolving like sugar in rain, because the board meeting loomed. Tanya's warning ringing. "They're questioning your leadership." And he clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, because he'd seen this play before. The way they'd twist anything to keep you small. But this time it was his company, his rules. And he muttered to himself, "Not yet. Not like this," because he'd built SkyWest from a regional puddle jumper to a national player. And he wasn't about to let a lie strip it away. But as he grabbed his jacket, the TV flickered. A pundit smirking. "Looks like SkyWest's CEO isn't who we thought." And Darius froze, the weight of it sinking in, because how do you prove you're not a monster when the world's already decided you are? And outside, the city hummed on, oblivious to the war brewing in his name, while Karen and Phil clinked coffee mugs, their laughter sharp and hollow, because they'd landed the first blow, and it was a damn good one. But they didn't know, couldn't know, that Darius wasn't the type to stay down. Not when the stakes were this high. Not when the truth was still his to wield. And as he stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft thud, he dialed Tanya again. "Get me everything on Voss and Grayson, we're hitting back." Because this wasn't over, not by a mile, and the next move was his, even if the board, the employees, the whole damn internet thought he was finished. Because what they saw as a knockout was just the opening bell, and he'd make sure they felt every round. Darius Jackson felt the air thicken as he scrolled through X from his hotel suite, the Dallas skyline mocking him with its calm shimmer, while the doctored video of him lunging at Karen Voss racked up views, now past 200,000. The hashtag Darius the Threat, sprawling across the platform like wildfire on dry grass. Each retweet a fresh jab. CEO or not, he's a menace. Sky West deserves better. And he clenched his jaw, the glow of his phone screen carving shadows into his face, because this wasn't just noise. This was a tidal wave, and he could hear it building outside, the faint hum of voices growing louder beyond the glass, because Phil Grayson hadn't stopped at the video. No, he'd spent the night working his old security contacts, whispering to a crew of loudmouths who loved a good fight, and by morning, they'd rallied a mob, 50, then 100, piling into pickup trucks with faded paint and Confederate flag decals, rolling up to Sky West's Dallas headquarters 5 miles from Darius's hotel, a squat brick building with tinted windows that usually kept the world at bay, but not today, because Phil stood at the edge of the parking lot, ball cap pulled low, barking into a megaphone. "We won't let thugs run our airlines," his voice, crackling over the crowd as they roared back, waving signs scrawled with "Fire Darius," and worse, slurs inked in red marker that made the air taste sour. And Karen was there too, hovering near the back, her hoodie swapped for a crisp blouse, playing the victim for anyone who'd listen. "He attacked me. I'm just glad people see the truth." Her words dripping with fake tears while a guy with a goatee nodded, filming her on his phone for some fringe blog that'd eat it up. And Darius, oblivious to the chaos brewing, had bigger fish to fry, because Tanya Brooks had texted, "Board's meeting at HQ, you need to be there." So he grabbed his keys, the leather of his jacket creaking as he moved, stepping into the elevator with a slow breath. Because how do you face a room of suits who think you're a PR nightmare when you're still picking glass out of your pride from yesterday? And he hit the garage, sliding into his black SUV, the engine rumbling to life as he pulled onto I-35. The highway stretching out like a lifeline he could still grab. But the city had other plans, because 10 minutes in, traffic slowed to a crawl, horns blaring, and he glanced out the window, spotting the smoke first, then the crowd spilling onto the road. A splinter group from the HQ protest, 20 or 30 of them, faces flushed red with rage, and they'd seen his plates, Sky WST1. A dead giveaway, so they swarmed, fists pounding the hood. "Get out, you piece of trash!" one screamed, a wiry guy in a stained tank top, while another, bald and beefy, hurled a bottle that cracked against the driver's side window, spiderwebbing the glass, and Darius gripped the wheel, heart slamming against his ribs because this wasn't a debate anymore. This was a hunt, and he floored it, tires squealing as he broke through, bottles and cans raining down, one smashing the windshield dead center, shards slicing across his cheek, warm blood trickling down as he swerved onto a side street, the mob shrinking in his rear view, their shouts fading but not the venom. And he pulled into an empty lot, breathing hard, the cut stinging as he touched it, his fingers coming away red. Because what kind of madness turns a lie into this? And he wiped the blood on his sleeve, the navy fabric soaking it up like a badge because he wasn't running. Not from this. So he called Tanya, voice steady despite the chaos. "Dig deeper, find out who's fueling this." Because Phil's megaphone rant wasn't random, it was a signal. And Karen's crocodile tears weren't just for show, they were bait, and he knew it. Because how do you fight a crowd that's already decided you're the enemy when the real puppet masters are laughing from the sidelines? And he checked his mirror, the cut shallow but angry, a thin line of crimson against his skin, and he muttered, "This ends now." Because he'd built Sky West with his own hands, pulled it out of bankruptcy when no one else would touch it, and he wasn't about to let a mob of bigots and a couple of petty tyrants tear it down. But as he restarted the engine, the radio crackled, a local station cutting in. Protests escalate outside Sky West HQ, CEO Darius Jackson under fire, and he turned it off, the silence heavier than the noise. Because the board was waiting, Tanya was scrambling, and the cut on his face was just the start. Because Phil and Karen weren't done, not by a long shot, and he could feel it, the way the air tightened around him. Because this wasn't a backlash, this was a war, and he drove on, the shattered windshield warping the world outside. Because every mile brought him closer to a reckoning he couldn't dodge. And as he neared HQ, the crowd's chants drifted through the broken glass. "No thugs in charge." A rhythm that pounded in time with his pulse, and he parked, stepping out into the heat, blood drying on his cheek because they'd drawn first blood, but he'd be damned if they got the last. And he straightened his jacket, the leather scuffed but unbroken because this was his company, his fight, and he'd make them regret ever stepping into his ring, even if the mob, the board, the whole damn city thought they had him cornered. Because Darius Jackson didn't break, he built, and he'd build his way out of this too, one bloody step at a time. Darius Jackson pulled into SkyWest's Dallas headquarters parking lot, the cut on his cheek still raw and stinging from the mob's bottle shattering his windshield, blood crusting along the edge as he stepped out of his battered SUV. The chance of no thugs in charge fading into a dull roar behind the tinted glass walls, because he wasn't about to let a pack of loudmouths stop him, not when Tanya Brooks had texted him mid-drive, "Found something big, call me," and he'd punched her number before the engine even cooled, her voice crackling through, sharp and urgent. "The video's fake, Darius, I've got proof." Because she'd spent the night digging, pulling an all-nighter with a tech guy from IT who owed her a favor, and they'd cracked it, spotting the edit where his arm lunged at Karen Voss, a sloppy splice that didn't match the shadows or the timing, and Darius grinned, tight and fierce. Good, send it to legal, because he could feel the tide shifting, even with the board waiting inside, their suits pressed, and their frowns deeper than the Grand Canyon. And he walked in, head high, the cut on his face a battle scar they couldn't ignore. Because how do you explain away blood when the story's still bleeding? And Tanya met him in the lobby, her navy blazer wrinkled, from hours hunched over a laptop handing him a USB drive. Full analysis, frame by frame, they can't deny this. And he nodded, slipping it into his pocket as they rode the elevator to the 10th floor. The hum of the machinery, the only sound between them, because she didn't need to say it. He knew she'd gone to war for him, and the boardroom doors swung open, 12 faces staring him down. The chairman, a gray-haired guy named Harold Vance, tapping a pen like he was counting down to judgment. "Darius, this is a mess." But he didn't flinch, sliding the USB across the table. "Play it." And they did. The tech guy patching it into a projector, the doctored clip side by side with Tanya's breakdown, every glitch exposed, the lunge unraveling into a lie, and the room went quiet. Harold's pen stopping mid-tap, because what do you say when the truth punches you in the face? And Darius leaned forward, voice low. "That's not me attacking anyone. That's me helping a passenger while your staff lost their damn minds." And the board shifted, murmurs rippling, because they couldn't argue with the pixels. So Harold cleared his throat. "We'll handle it." And by noon, SkyWest's legal team filed a defamation suit against Karen Voss and Phil Grayson, papers stamped and served, claiming damages for malicious falsehoods, and Darius watched from his office as the news broke, Channel 8 cutting in. SkyWest Airlines sues employees over fake video, CEO cleared, the anchor's voice steady as clips rolled, showing the real footage from Gate C-19, Rosa's trembling hands, his calm restraint, and the board called him back in. Harold standing this time. "We stand by you, Darius. This stops here." And the room clapped, slow at first. Then, loud, a wave of hands slapping tables, because he'd turned their doubt into loyalty. And he walked out, the cut on his cheek itching as it scabbed over. The applause trailing him to the elevator, because this felt like redemption. Didn't it? A second win carved out of the mess, and he drove back to the hotel, the shattered windshield replaced by a rental's clean glass, the city blurring past as news vans chased the story, outlets retracting their violent CEO headlines, one even calling him a model of grace under fire. And he let himself breathe deep and slow, because maybe this was it. Maybe he'd beaten the machine, so he sat on the suite's balcony, Dallas sprawling below, sketching a plan on his tablet, a full overhaul of SkyWest's policies, mandatory training on bias, a hotline for passengers like Rosa, because he'd make damn sure this never happened again. And his phone buzzed, a text from an old friend. "Saw the news, proud of you, man." And he smiled, real and wide, because the world was watching now, seeing him for who he was, not what they'd painted him to be. But across town, Karen and Phil weren't clapping. No, they sat in Phil's cramped apartment, blinds drawn, the defamation suit burning a hole in their plans. Karen pacing, "They think this is over." And Phil smirked, cracking a beer. "Let 'em celebrate. We've got more." Because they weren't slinking off. Not when Phil had cop buddies who'd do worse than edit a video. And Darius didn't see it, didn't hear the gears grinding, because he stood on that balcony, the wind cool against his face, thinking the storm had passed. But what happens when the people you've beaten don't just lick their wounds, when they've got a bigger knife to sharpen? So if you're cheering Darius's comeback, drop a comment with #1 below, because who else thinks he deserves this win after taking that mob's hits? And if you're fired up for justice, smash that like button, hit subscribe, because we're not done yet. Trust me, this fight's got teeth. And tell me this, how do you keep standing when the ground's still shaking, when the ones who lost are plotting a blow so dirty it makes a fake video look like child's play? Because what's coming next might just break everything Darius thought he'd fixed. Darius Jackson stood on his hotel balcony, the Dallas night air brushing cool against the scabbed cut on his cheek, the city lights twinkling like they were celebrating his second win, the defamation suit against Karen Voss and Phil Grayson humming. In the background, Sky West's board clapping him on the back just hours ago, and he'd let himself think, just for a breath, that he'd turned the tide, that the machine grinding against him had stalled. But across town, Phil wasn't sipping beer in defeat. No. He sat in a dimly lit bar off Harry Hines Boulevard, the kind of place where the jukebox buzzed more than it played, his buzz cut catching the neon glow as he leaned into a booth, talking low with a guy named Ray, an ex-cop with a gut spilling over his belt and a grin like a jackal, because Phil had history with Ray from back when they patrolled together, busting kids in the wrong neighborhoods for less than a dime bag. And Phil slid a crumpled 50 across the table. Need a favor, something big? His voice rough, eyes glinting, and Ray nodded. What's the play? So Phil laid it out. Darius Jackson, Sky West's big shot, I want him gone. And Ray smirked. Easy, got a guy inside his hotel. Because corruption didn't sleep, not in a city where badges bent for the right price. And by 11 that night, Ray's contact, a maintenance worker with sticky fingers, slipped into Darius's suite while he was out grabbing a burger, planting a baggie of cocaine in his suitcase, tucked under a stack of pressed shirts, the powder stark white against the dark fabric. And Phil didn't stop there, calling in another favor to a dispatcher who owed him, raid him midnight, make it loud. Because what's the point of a frame job if it doesn't hit like a sledgehammer? And Darius, oblivious, walked back into his room at 11:45, the burger's grease still on his fingers, kicking off his shoes as he flipped on the TV, catching the tail end of a sports recap, the Mavericks up by 6, and he sank into the couch, the weight of the day easing off his shoulders, because tomorrow he'd pitch that reform plan, rewrite Sky West from the inside. But then the door exploded inward, wood splintering as 6 cops stormed in, guns drawn, flashlights blinding. Hands up, Jackson, the lead one barked, a squat guy with a mustache and a snarl. And Darius froze, burger dropping to the floor, his pulse slamming as he raised his arms slow. What the hell? But they didn't answer, shoving him against the wall, his cheeks scraping plaster, the scab tearing open fresh, blood trickling. Again as they cuffed him, metal biting his wrists. And the mustache guy yanked open his suitcase, pulling out the baggie like he'd won the lottery. Well, look at this, his voice thick with glee. CEO's got a side hustle, and Darius's stomach dropped. That's not mine. But they laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, dragging him out into the hall. Cameras flashing from the crowd that had gathered, hotel guests in robes, phones up, because Phil had tipped a local stringer. Big arrest at the Hilton, get there. And the lenses caught it all. Darius in cuffs, navy suit rumpled, blood on his face, the perfect shot for tomorrow's headlines. And they hauled him down the elevator, out into the muggy night, sirens wailing as they shoved him into a squad car, the door slamming shut like a coffin lid. And across town, Karen watched. It live on Channel 8, her apartment dark except for the TV's glow, her smirk wide as the anchor crowed. Sky West CEO Darius Jackson arrested on drug charges. And she leaned back, whispering, "Got you." Because this wasn't just revenge. This was annihilation. And Phil, still at the bar, clinked a shot glass with Ray. Told you he's done. Because who'd believe a black man over a baggie of coke when the system's already itching to bury him? And Darius sat in the car, head pounding, the cut stinging. Because how do you fight a lie this deep when it's got handcuffs and a badge? But the real gut punch came later. Because in Phoenix, Rosa Morales sat in her daughter's living room, the TV flickering as the news hit, her shaky hands clutching a mug of tea that crashed to the floor when she saw Darius's face, cuffed and bloodied, and she gasped, "No, not him," her voice breaking as her knees buckled, the stress ripping through her fragile frame, and she collapsed, her daughter screaming, "Mama!" rushing to her side as the screen kept rolling. Jackson's arrest raises questions about SkyWest's leadership, and Rosa hit the carpet, breath shallow, because the man who'd helped her was drowning now, and she couldn't bear it. And Darius, locked in the squad car, stared out the cracked window, Dallas blurring past. Because this wasn't about drugs, this was about power, about a system that'd rather frame him than face him. And he clenched his fists, the cuffs cutting deeper, because he'd thought he'd won. Thought the board's applause meant something. But Phil and Karen had flipped the board, and now he was the pawn. And as the car turned into the precinct, lights harsh against the concrete, he muttered, "This isn't the end." Because he'd built SkyWest from nothing, and he'd claw his way out of this too, even if the world saw him as a criminal now, even if Rosa's collapse was on his shoulders, because the machine didn't rest, and neither would he. Not until every gear that turned against him was smashed to pieces. Darius Jackson sat on a hard metal bench in a Dallas precinct holding cell. The cuffs gone, but his wrists raw and red, the cut on his cheek oozing fresh blood down his jaw from the rough shove against his hotel wall, the air thick with sweat, and bleach as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the concrete floor where he stared, because the arrest still echoed in his skull, the planted cocaine baggie flashing like a neon sign. And he knew Phil Grayson and Karen Voss had orchestrated this, a gut punch from the shadows after he'd dared to sue them, but the cell wasn't. Quiet, no. 2 guards prowled outside the bars, one a lanky guy with a buzz cut and a sneer, the other stocky with a neck tattoo peeking from his collar, and they didn't whisper, didn't bother hiding it. "Thought you were hot stuff, huh, CEO?" the lanky one spat, his voice dripping venom as he rattled a baton against the bars, the clang sharp and deliberate. And Darius looked up, slow, his eyes locking onto theirs, because he'd heard this tune before, every note of it. But the stocky one grinned, stepping closer. "Resisting arrest, that's what we'll say." And before Darius could blink, the baton swung, cracking against his shoulder, pain exploding white-hot as he stumbled back, hitting the bench, and the lanky one laughed. "Yeah, keep fighting. Makes it easier," landing a fist to his gut, doubling him over, air rushing out in a grunt. Because this wasn't about protocol. This was about power, about reminding him where they thought he belonged, and he tasted blood, the cut on his cheek splitting wider. But he didn't yell, didn't beg, just straightened up, slow and steady, staring them down. "Write that down too." His voice low, gravelly, because he'd memorized their badges, numbers glinting in the light, and they froze, just for a second, before the stocky one smirked. "Big man, huh?" And they walked off, boots echoing down the hall, leaving him bruised but unbroken. Because how do you break a man who's been forged in worse fires than this? And hours crawled by, the cells cold seeping into his bones, until a door clanged open, Tanya Brooks storming in, her navy blazer swapped for a hoodie, eyes blazing as she slapped a bail receipt on the desk. "He's out now," her voice cutting through the precinct's hum, and the desk sergeant shrugged, unlocking the cell, because 10 grand cash moved fast, and Darius stood, wincing as his shoulder throbbed, following her out into the muggy night, the squad car's light still flashing in his memory. And Tanya didn't waste time. "Phil's got cop friends. This was a setup," her words clipped as she handed him his phone. "But we've got something," because she'd pulled the hotel's security feed while he was locked up, a grainy clip showing the maintenance guy slipping into his room, planting the baggie, then the cops finding it after a search that started empty, and Darius's jaw tightened. Leak it, because he wasn't waiting for a courtroom to clear his name, not when the world was already feasting on his mugshot. And Tanya nodded, firing it off to a journalist she trusted, a woman named Lena Cruz, who'd broken bigger scandals. And by dawn, the story hit. SkyWest CEO framed, arrest footage raises questions, the clip spreading faster than Karen's lie, showing the plant, the empty search, the smug cops. And Darius watched from Tanya's car, parked in a diner lot, his bruised shoulder aching as X lit up. This is corruption. Free Darius. Hashtags flipping from hate to fury, and protests sparked, not at Sky West HQ this time, but outside the precinct. 100 people, then 200. Black folks, Latinos, even some white allies, chanting justice for Jackson, signs waving in the gray morning light, because the video didn't lie, not this time. And Darius felt it, that shift, the crowd's roar washing over him like a balm. Because how do you stay down when strangers fight for you? And he leaned back, blood drying on his shirt because this was a win, wasn't it? A crack in the wall Phil and Karen had built, and Lena's article dropped. Systemic bias or personal vendetta? The truth behind Jackson's arrest, naming Phil's cop ties, and the precinct scrambled, the guards' faces plastered online, because the public didn't forgive this, not when it was raw and real, and Darius looked at Tanya. They're not stopping, because he knew Phil, knew Karen, they'd claw back harder, and she nodded. Then neither do we, because this wasn't over, not with Rosa collapsed in Phoenix, not with his sister, still out there, and he rubbed his shoulder, the bruise pulsing, because the cell had tested him, but it hadn't broken him. And as the protest grew, horns honking, voices rising, he muttered, "Let's see how they like this," because he'd turned their trap into a spotlight, shining it right on their filth, and the precinct's walls seemed to shake. The system rattled, but Phil and Karen weren't in the crowd. No, they were plotting. Their next move brewing darker than the bruises on his skin, because a win like this didn't end the war. It just lit the fuse for the next explosion. Darius Jackson leaned against the cracked vinyl seat of Tanya Brooks's car, parked in a diner lot outside Dallas, the bruise on his shoulder throbbing under his torn shirt, the taste of precinct blood still bitter on his tongue. But the protests, roaring outside the station, felt like a lifeline, their chants of justice for Jackson vibrating through the morning haze as he watched the leaked arrest footage flip the script. Phil Grayson's frame job exposed for the world to see, and he'd let himself think, just for a second, that he'd clawed back some ground, that the crowd's fury might shield him from the next hit. But Phil wasn't watching the news. No, he sat in a rusted trailer 30 miles east, a cigarette dangling from his lip as he dialed a number on a prepaid phone, the kind you ditch in a ditch when the job's done. And his voice rasped, "He's still standing, fix that." Because losing the defamation suit and the cop setup hadn't broken him. It had fueled him. So he called in 3 guys from his old security days, roughnecks with rap sheets and a taste for chaos, and they didn't ask questions, just grabbed crowbars and gasoline, piling into a beat-up van headed for Houston, 300 miles south, where Darius's sister, Keisha Jackson, lived in a quiet suburb, a single mom with a clapboard house and a garden she'd planted with her kid, because Phil had dug into Darius's life, found the soft spot, and aimed straight for it. And Darius didn't know, couldn't know, as he sipped burnt coffee with Tanya, plotting their next move, that the clock was ticking, because Keisha was home that night, her son asleep upstairs, the TV flickering with a sitcom laugh track as she folded laundry, the air still and warm through an open window, until the crash came, glass shattering as the front door splintered, 3 men bursting in, hoods up, boots stomping, and she screamed, dropping the basket, "Who are you?" But they didn't answer, swinging crowbars into the walls, drywall crumbling, pictures of her boy crashing to the floor, and one, a wiry guy with a scar across his cheek, grabbed her arm, shoving her against the couch. "Tell your brother to back off," his voice a hiss as he tossed a note at her feet, scrawled in black ink, "Back off or she's next," and she kicked, fought, "Get out!" But they laughed, tearing through the house, smashing her TV, ripping cushions, and the scarred one lit a match, tossing it onto a puddle of gas by the kitchen. Flames licking up fast, and they bolted, leaving her coughing in the smoke, scrambling to grab her phone as the fire spread, dialing Darius with shaking hands. "They're here." They trashed everything, her voice breaking, sobs choking her words. "There's a cross burning outside." And Darius dropped the coffee, the cup splattering on the asphalt. "Keisha, what?" Because the words didn't compute, not until she wailed, "They said it's for you." And his blood ran cold, the diner's neon buzzing in his ears as he yelled, "Get out now, I'm coming!" And Tanya floored it, tires screeching as they hit I-45 south, 300 miles to Houston, the speedometer climbing past 90. Because how do you sit still when your sister's house is ash and a cross burns in her yard? And he gripped the door, mind racing because this was Phil. Had to be, striking where it hurt most. And Keisha stumbled outside, dragging her son, the boy crying as sirens wailed in the distance, flames licking the roof, and she sank to the grass, staring at the cross, 8 feet tall, blazing against the night, a symbol that hadn't died in her lifetime, and neighbors gawked, some filming, others running to help, but she just clutched her kid. The note crumpled in her fist because this wasn't random. This was war. And Darius pushed Tanya's car to its limit, the road blurring, his shoulder screaming with every jolt. Because he'd thought the precinct was the bottom, but this was deeper, uglier. And he made it by 3 a.m., pulling up to a street lit red by fire trucks. Keisha's house smoldering, the cross still smoking in the yard, and she ran to him, collapsing, into his arms. "They knew you, Darius," her voice raw, tears streaking her face, and he held her tight, the smell of charred wood choking the air, because this was his fault, wasn't it? Pushing back too hard, and he saw the note, the threat. "Back off, or she's next." And his stomach twisted, rage boiling over as he stared at the wreckage, the cross's embers glowing like eyes, and he whispered, "They're dead for this." Because Phil and Karen had crossed a line no one walked back from, and he'd make them pay. Every last one. Because how do you let this stand when it's your blood, your home, torched for spite? So if you're sickened by this attack on Keisha, drop a comment with #1 below, because who else thinks a family shouldn't burn for a man's fight? And if you're raging at this injustice, hit that like button, subscribe, because we're in this deep and you won't believe what's next, trust me. Because tell me this, how do you strike back when they've hit your heart? When the flames are out but the war's just catching fire? Because what's Darius got left to lose when they've already taken everything but his fight? Darius Jackson stood in the smoky wreckage of his sister Keisha's Houston yard, the charred cross still smoldering as dawn broke gray and heavy. His arms wrapped tight around her trembling frame, her son clinging to her leg, tears streaking their faces while fire trucks rumbled away, leaving a crowd of neighbors whispering behind police tape, and he felt the note's weight in his pocket. Back off or she's next. The ink burned into his brain, because Phil Grayson and Karen Voss had gone too far, turning his fight into a torch that lit up Keisha's life, and he pulled her closer. "I'm fixing this." His voice a low growl. Because how do you sleep when your family's home is ash and a death threat hangs over them? And he glanced at the security camera above her porch, a cheap thing he'd installed last Christmas, its red light blinking steady through the chaos, and hope flickered, because maybe it caught something. So he called Tanya Brooks, still bleary from the 300-mile drive. "Check Keisha's cam now," and she didn't argue, peeling off to a gas station with her laptop as he stayed with Keisha, helping her pack a bag, the air thick with soot and grief, because she wouldn't stay here, not with that cross's ghost looming, and Tanya rang back 30 minutes later, voice sharp. "Got it. Clear as day." Because the footage showed them, 3 hooded figures smashing in, crowbars swinging, the scarred one lighting the gas, their faces slipping into view as masks shifted, and Darius clenched his fist. "Send it to Lena Cruz." Because the journalist who'd broken his arrest story could break this too, and he drove Keisha and her boy to a hotel, the Houston skyline smudging past as he promised, "You're safe now." His words firm but his gut twisting, because Phil's reach was long, and this wasn't over. But by noon, Lena's article hit. Sky West CEO's family targeted in hate crime, the security clip attached, raw and unedited, going viral faster than Phil's fake video, 2 million views in hours. The scarred guy's sneer plastered across X, and the Houston PD couldn't ignore it, not with the cross burning bright, so they moved, arresting the 3 goons by 2 p.m., hauling them in cuffs as cameras flashed, because hate crimes didn't play quiet in a city that loud. And Darius watched the news from the hotel, Keisha, asleep on the bed, her son curled beside her, the TV muted but the ticker screaming, suspects linked to Sky West employee Phil Grayson, because Lena had dug deeper, tying Phil's burner phone to the crew, and Sky West's board didn't. "Wait, calling an emergency meeting?" Harold Vance's voice crackling over the line. He's fired, effective now, because Phil's fingerprints were all over this. And Darius nodded. Good. His shoulder still aching from the precinct beating. Because this was justice, wasn't it? A piece of it anyway. And Karen got hit next, her union dropping her like a hot coal. We don't defend arsonists, their statement blunt, because the footage didn't lie. And her name was mud now, tied to Phil's mess. And Darius drove back to Dallas that night, the road humming under his tires, pulling into SkyWest HQ. At dawn, the building quiet except for a handful of staff who'd stayed late, and they saw him. Cut face, bruised shoulder, navy suit scuffed but standing, and they clapped. Not the board's polite taps, but real, loud, fists banging desks. Because he'd taken the hits and kept swinging, and Harold met him in the lobby. You're a hero, Darius. Integrity's got a face now. And the board doubled down, issuing a press release. SkyWest stands with our CEO, and crowds gathered outside, not with signs of hate this time, but support. Darius strong. Painted on banners because the video, the arrests, the cross. It flipped the script and news vans swarmed, Channel 8 calling him a titan unbroken. And he stood at his office window, Dallas waking up below, because this felt like triumph, didn't it? A third win carved from fire and blood, and he sat with Keisha later, her hand steady now. You did it, big brother. And he hugged her. Not yet. Because Phil's crew was locked up. But Phil and Karen were still out there, and he knew they wouldn't fade, not with their claws this deep. So he walked into HQ again, staff cheering, their voices echoing off the glass, and he smiled, small but real, because the world saw him now. Not the thug, not the criminal, but the man who'd faced a mob, a frame, a fire, and stood taller. And he thought of Rosa, collapsed in Phoenix, of Keisha's burned garden, and he swore, this ends soon, because he'd protect them all, rebuild it all. And as the sun climbed, casting gold over the city, he felt the weight lift, just a little because the board named him hero. The crowd roared his name, and Phil and Karen were bleeding power. But he didn't see her yet. Karen pacing her apartment, unhinged, her fingers, tapping a new plan, because a union drop and a firing didn't stop her. No. They lit a fuse, and Darius, basking in this fragile glory, didn't hear the ticking. Not yet. Because how do you rest when the snake's still coiled, waiting to strike? Darius Jackson walked out of SkyWest Dallas headquarters, the morning sun glinting off the glass facade, as staff cheers still rang in his ears. His bruised shoulder a dull ache under his navy suit, the cut on his cheek scabbed tight because he'd just buried Phil Grayson's crew with that Houston footage, watched the board fire Phil and Karen's union ditch her, and the crowd outside had roared his name. Darius strong, a third win that felt like steel in his spine. But he didn't linger, climbing into a rental SUV to head back to his hotel, the city humming around him as he dialed Tanya Brooks. I'm flying to Phoenix tomorrow, check on Rosa, because her collapse still gnawed at him, and Tanya's voice crackled back. Plane's ready, your usual, meaning the small SkyWest jet he kept for personal hops. A sleek six-seater he'd piloted himself back when he was proving the company could soar, and he nodded. Good, I'll handle it, because he needed the sky, the control after weeks of chaos. But across town, Karen Voss wasn't clapping. No, she paced her cramped apartment, blinds shut, the TV muted on a loop of Darius's hero story, her blonde hair tangled, eyes wild, because the union drop and Phil's firing had stripped her bare, left her nothing but rage, and she wasn't done, not when she could still hit him where it hurt. So she grabbed her phone, scrolling contacts until she hit Eddie Malone, a SkyWest mechanic with a gambling debt and a shaky moral compass. And she called, voice low, Eddie, it's me. Need a favor? And he hesitated. Karen, I heard you're out. But she cut him off. $5,000 cash, you mess with Jackson's plane. Because she'd scraped her savings, a desperate last play, and Eddie swallowed hard. What kind? And she smirked. Engine, make it fail, mid-air, because a crash would end him, no questions. And Eddie, sweating, agreed, tomorrow, before takeoff, because $5,000 bought silence, and Darius slept that night, dreamless, the hotel sheets cool against his skin, waking at 5 a.m. to pack. The Phoenix trip a lifeline to Rosa, to sanity, and he drove to DFW's private hangar, the jet gleaming under floodlights, a crisp white bird with SkyWest's logo on the tail, and he did his walk-around, meticulous, because he'd flown enough to spot trouble. But Eddie had been clever, loosening a fuel line deep in the engine, a slow bleed that'd choke it at 10,000 feet, and Darius missed it, climbing aboard, the leather seat creaking as he buckled in, firing up the controls, the hum steady as he taxied out, and ground crew waved him off. Clear skies, Mr. Jackson. Because they didn't know, couldn't know, and he lifted off, Dallas shrinking below, the jet climbing smooth through 6,000, 8,000, the clouds parting like a promise, and he exhaled, the cut on his cheek itching as he leveled off at 12,000, Phoenix 3 hours out, because this was his, the sky, the company, a moment to breathe, but then it hit, a shudder rocking the cabin, the engine coughing, spluttering, and the dash lit red. Fuel pressure low, the alarm blaring as power dropped, and he gripped the yoke. Come on. Because he'd flown through storms. But this was different. This was sabotage. And the jet dipped, nose heavy, altitude bleeding fast. 9,000, 8,000, the Texas plains sprawling below, and he flipped switches, rerouting what fuel he could because he wasn't a passenger. He was a pilot, damn it. And he'd landed worse. But the engine quit, a dead whine filling the cockpit, and he keyed the radio. Mayday, SkyWest 902. Engine failure going down. His voice steady even as his heart slammed. Because how do you stay calm when death's knocking and air traffic scrambled? Nearest field 5 miles west. But the jet was falling. 6,000, 5,000. The ground rushing up, a patchwork of dirt and scrub. And he wrestled, the controls gliding silent, sweat beading on his forehead because he saw Keisha's face, Rosa's, Tanya's. And he wasn't dying today. Not for Phil, not for Karen. So he aimed for a flat stretch, wings wobbling, 4,000, 3,000, and he braced. Hold on, to no one but himself, because the jet hit, skidding hard, metal screeching as it tore through soil, a wing snapping off, the fuselage twisting, and he jolted forward, belt cutting into his chest, head slamming the panel, blood gushing from a new gash above his eye. And it stopped, dust clouding the cracked windshield, the silence deafening because he was alive, somehow alive. And he coughed, unbuckling with shaking hands, kicking the door open as sirens wailed in the distance, medics racing across the field because someone had seen it, called it in, and they found him, staggering out, blood streaming down his face, suit torn, shoulder screaming but standing, and they swarmed. Sir, sit down, a paramedic yelled, but he waved them off. I'm fine. Because he wasn't, not really, but he'd walked away, and as they patched him up, the jet's wreckage smoked behind him, a mangled testament to Karen's hate. Because this wasn't an accident, this was murder, and he knew it, felt it, and as the medics wrapped his head, he muttered, she's done. Because Eddie's hands had her prints all over them, and he'd find them, burn them. Because how do you come back from a crash meant to kill you, when the woman who lit the match thought she'd won? Darius Jackson lay in a sterile hospital bed 20 miles west of Dallas, the gash above his eye stitched tight, blood crusting his torn Navy suit as monitors beeped steady, his shoulder a throbbing knot from the jet crash that had nearly claimed him, the wreckage still smoking in a field where medics had dragged him out, alive but battered. And he stared at the ceiling, the hum of fluorescent lights drilling into his skull, because he knew that engine failure wasn't chance, not with Karen Voss and Phil Grayson's claws this deep. And Tanya Brooks burst in, her hoodie swapped for a crisp blazer, eyes wide. Darius, you're awake, her voice sharp with relief as she dropped a folder on the tray. Eddie Malone, the mechanic, he talked, because the cops had scooped him up an hour after the crash, his greasy fingerprints all over the fuel line, and he'd cracked fast, spilling it under the precinct's hot lights. Karen paid me $5,000 to rig it, his confession scrawled in black ink, and Darius sat up, wincing. Arrest her. His words a rasp, because this was murder, not a game. And Tanya nodded. They did. She's in cuffs. Because Dallas PD had stormed her apartment, kicking in the door as she screamed, I'm innocent. But the cash in her drawer and Eddie's testimony locked her down, and Darius exhaled, slow and jagged. Because this felt like the end, didn't it? Karen finally caught, but the TV on the wall flickered, Channel 8 breaking. Inadorishi, SkyWest employee arrested in CEO crash plot. The anchor's voice clipped as footage rolled. Karen in cuffs, head bowed, and he thought of Keisha's burned house, Rosa's collapse, the precinct beating because this was her, all of it. But then the screen shifted. A new face, Senator William Hargrove, a silver-haired Texan with a drawl and a tie pin shaped like a lone star, stepping to a podium. "This is a travesty," his voice booming. Karen Voss is a scapegoat. Darius Jackson framed her to save his sinking ship, and Darius froze, the stitches pulling tight. Because Hargrove wasn't just some loudmouth. He was a state power broker, a man who'd built his career on law and order with a wink to the old guard. And he kept going. Jackson's the real criminal, planting drugs, staging this crash, spinning a tale so wild it stuck because he had fake witnesses, 2 ex-cops from Phil's circle, swearing they'd seen Darius bribe Eddie, and the senator's lawyer filed a motion. Release Ms. Voss, investigate the CEO. Because Hargrove didn't just defend Karen, he weaponized her, and Darius gripped the bedrail. What the hell? Because this wasn't Phil's petty grudge. This was a juggernaut, and Tanya's phone buzzed, Harold Vance from the board. "Darius, we've got a problem." His tone shaky. "Hargrove's got pull. Shareholders are spooked, they're saying we should suspend you." And Darius's stomach dropped. Suspend me? Because he'd just walked out of a fireball. And now this, the board wavering again. Their applause from yesterday dissolving like smoke, and he saw it play out. X lighting up with Darius fraud, the senator's speech clipped and shared. A man like him can't be trusted. Hargrove's dog whistle loud and clear. And news. Vans swarmed the hospital, lenses pressing against the glass because the smear hit hard. CEOs crash a hoax? Headlines screaming, and Darius lay back, head pounding, blood seeping through the bandage. Because how do you fight a lie this big when you're bedridden, when a senator's got the system in his pocket? And Tanya paced. "We've got Eddie's confession we can push back." But he shook his head. Not enough, not against him. Because Hargrove wasn't Phil, wasn't Karen. He was a kingmaker who'd bury him in mud and call it justice. And the board called again, Harold's voice tight. "We're meeting tomorrow, Darius. We might have to act." Because the shareholders were dumping stock, SkyWest's name tanking, and he saw Keisha's face, her torched home, Rosa's frail hands. Because this wasn't just about him. It was everyone he'd fought for, and Hargrove kept it coming. A press conference outside the courthouse. "I've known Ms. Voss for years, a fine woman railroaded by a corrupt executive." His smile slick as oil, and Karen sat in her cell, smirking through the bars, because the senator's play gave her hope, a lifeline. And Darius felt it slipping, the company he'd built, the wins he'd clawed, because the board's doubt was a knife, and he couldn't stand, couldn't fight, not with his body wrecked. And Tanya grabbed the folder. "I'll get more, we'll find something." But he stared at the ceiling. They've got the narrative, because Hargrove's power dwarfed Phil's, dwarfed Karen's, and the TV, looped, pundits nodding. Maybe the senator's right. And he clenched his fists, stitches straining. Because this was the final blow, wasn't it? A counterattack so deep it hit his soul. And he thought of the jet, the field, the blood, because he'd survived that. But this might bury him. And as the hospital hummed around him, machines, beeping, nurses whispering, he muttered, "Not yet," because he'd faced worse, hadn't he? But Hargrove's shadow loomed, unbeatable, and the board's silence deafened, because everything he'd won was crumbling, and he didn't know if he could climb out this time, not when the system itself was the enemy swinging the axe. Darius Jackson lay propped in his hospital bed, the stitches above his eye pulling tight, his bruised shoulder screaming under the weight of a thin gown, the TV blaring Senator William Hargrove's smug drawl. Darius Jackson framed an innocent woman, as the board's doubt hung like a noose. SkyWest's stock plummeting while Karen Voss smirked from her cell, because Hargrove's smear campaign had teeth, Fake witnesses swearing he'd staged the crash, the drug plant, everything. And he felt the walls closing, his company, his fight, slipping through bloodied fingers. But then the door swung open. Rosa Morales shuffling in, her silver hair loose, a cane steadying her frail frame after the collapse in Phoenix, her daughter trailing behind, and Darius blinked. "Rosa, you shouldn't be here." His voice hoarse, but she shook her head, fierce. "I had to," and pulled a cracked old phone from her purse. "I recorded it, that day at the gate, because back at C-19, when Karen had shoved him, Rosa's shaky hands had hit record, catching more than the viral clip. Karen's voice hissing off camera, 'I hate people like him, thinking they own the place.' A raw, unfiltered snarl that pinned her hate to the wall. And Darius sat up, pain forgotten. "Play it." Because this wasn't just proof, it was a bomb. And Rosa did, the audio scratchy but clear. Karen's venom echoing in the sterile room, and Tanya Brooks, pacing beside him, snatched the phone. This changes everything. Because Hargrove's whole scapegoat lie crumbled with that one line. And Darius nodded. "Get it to Lena." Because the journalist could detonate this, and Tanya was already dialing, but she wasn't done. "I've got more," pulling a laptop from her bag. Hargrove's dirty, because she'd spent the night digging, hacking favors from an old college friend in D.C., and she'd found it. Photos of Hargrove at a hate group rally 10 years back, arm around a known supremacist, donation records tying him to the same crew, and Darius's jaw tightened. Leak it all, because this wasn't defense, this was war. And by noon, Lena Cruz dropped the story. Sky West CEO vindicated, audio. Proves Voss's bias, senator linked to hate, the recording blasting across X. Rosa's clip racking up 5 million views. Hargrove's rally pics side by side, and the tide flipped, fast and brutal. Jurors Karen lied trending. Hargrove exposed, right behind, because the public didn't swallow this, not when it was this raw. And Dallas PD doubled down, charging Karen with conspiracy to commit murder. No bail. Because the audio tied her to Eddie's sabotage, and Hargrove's office flooded with calls, his podium empty as aides scrambled. Because how do you spin a swastika on your resume? And Darius watched it unfold, the TV switching to Lena's live report. Jackson's been targeted from day one. As protests hit Austin, crowds outside the senator's mansion. "Resign," their signs blazing, and Sky West's board called, Harold Vance's voice shaky. "Darius, we're with you." But he cut in. Not good enough, because he was done with waverers, and Tanya patched him into the meeting from the hospital, his face on a screen, bloodshot eyes burning. "Half of you doubted me, you're out." And he fired them. 6 suits gone in 10 minutes, Harold included, because he'd built this company, crashed for it, bled for it, and he wasn't sharing it with cowards, appointing Tanya COO on the spot. "You've got my back, now take the reins." And she nodded, always, because she'd fought beside him through every blow, and he stood, wobbly but upright, discharged that afternoon, driving back to DFW with Rosa beside him, the airport. Buzzing as he walked through. No cuffs, no guards, just staff staring, some clapping because the news had spread. CEO cleans house, and he passed gate C-19, the sign dull now. No Karen, no Phil, just a quiet hum. And Rosa gripped his arm. "You're a good man." Her voice soft, and he smiled. "So are you," because she'd saved him. Her, recording the key that broke the lock, and he stood at SkyWest's hangar. The wrecked jet hauled off, vowing to rebuild, not just planes, but the system. No more bias, no more silence. His words a promise to the staff, to Keisha, to Rosa, and Channel 8 ran it live. Jackson takes control, vows reform. As Hargrove resigned that night, a terse statement, effective immediately, his career ash. And Karen faced trial, her cell cold. No senator to save her, because the empire she'd leaned on collapsed. And Darius walked into HQ the next day. Tanya at his side, the new board small but loyal, and he spoke. We start fresh, dignity first, because he'd survived a gate, a mob, a cell, a fire, a crash, and he'd won, not just for him, but for every soul the machine tried to crush. And as Dallas sprawled below his office window, he stood taller, scars and all, because they knew who he was now, a man who'd turned their hate into dust, and the fight wasn't over. But the victory was his, undeniable, unshakable. Darius Jackson's journey in this story is a brutal yet powerful lesson in resilience against systemic racism. First, it shows how quickly kindness, like helping Rosa Morales, can be twisted into a threat when prejudice blinds those in power, like Karen Voss. Darius faced escalating attacks, from public humiliation to a near-fatal plane crash, proving that racism doesn't just sting, it strikes to destroy. Yet, his refusal to break under mob violence, false arrests, and family threats teaches us that strength isn't just physical. It's a fire in the soul that burns hotter with every blow. The story also exposes the machinery of hate: Phil's dirty cops, Karen's sabotage, Senator Hargrove's lies, reminding us that injustice thrives when good people stay silent. Rosa's recording and Tanya's loyalty flipped the script, showing that truth and allies can dismantle even the tallest towers of corruption. Darius's final purge of the wavering board hammers home a key takeaway. Real change demands cutting out the rot, not patching it. This isn't just a win for him, it's a blueprint for fighting back. Smart, relentless, unapologetic. So, what's the big lesson? Racism may swing hard, but it's no match for a man who knows his worth and wields it like a weapon. Now let's hear from you. How would you stand up if the system turned on you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if Darius's fight fired you up. Subscribe for more racism stories that hit deep, and share this with anyone who needs to see justice in action. Thanks for writing this wild tale with us. Here's to courage that outlasts the storm and a future where no one's judged by the skin they're in.